These are common acronyms used throughout this presentation. Enrollment in WAMS, the Waiver Management System, is a must prior to services being provided. WAMS can be utilized for forms, guidance documents, manuals, and online training videos. Employment and Community Transportation Service is covered under all three DD waivers to include the building independence, family and individual support, and community living waivers. The purpose of employment and community transportation is to enable individuals to gain access to an individual's place of employment or volunteer activity, other community services or events, activities and resources, homes of families or friends, civic organizations or social clubs, public meetings or other civic activities, and spiritual activities or events as specified by the support plan. As with any service available for individuals with DD waivers, the individual needs to choose to use employment and community transportation. The provider does not have the right to choose it for him or her. It is important to have discussion about what the individual is interested in for their life, activities, and community connections, and determine if ECT would appropriately support their vision. Employment and community transportation does not replace medical transportation or transportation services under the state plan. The goal of employment and community transportation is to promote the individual's independence and participation in the life of their community. Use of this service requires that transportation be related to the individual's desired outcomes as stated in their ISP. Let's review provider criteria for employment and community transportation. Providers of ECT service can provide transportation with a few restrictions. Let's look at the chart. For an individual under the age of 18, they can have a friend over 18, a sibling, or another family member provide service for them. The parent, step-parent, or legal guardian may not. The spouse may not either for any individuals who are married under 18 who are emancipated. For individuals 18 and over, all of these categories are able to provide the service for them except for their spouse. Providers for employment and community transportation for an individual may be the individual's family member or legally responsible person. If the individual is under 18 years old, it cannot be provided by their guardian, parent, or step-parent. For an individual who is over 18 years of age, their spouse cannot provide the service. Employment and Community Transportation Service, ECT, shall be offered through an administering agency to include either any Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services license to provide services for individuals with disabilities, or a current provider of benefits planning, group and/or individual supported employment, or workplace assistance services, an employment service organization, or a center for independent living. Administering agencies shall be enrolled with DMAS through a participation agreement to provide employment and community transportation. In the case of private transportation, the administering agency shall be responsible for screening community persons to drive the individual to designated locations according to the ISP. This includes verification of the private drivers having possession of a current valid driver's license and no reckless driving charges within the last 24 months, possession of car insurance, and ensuring that the driver is 18 years of age or older. Initially and annually, the administering provider shall verify and document that each private driver possesses a current valid driver's license and car insurance. In the case of private transportation, the administering agency shall be responsible also for the completion of an attestation signed by the private driver, the individual, and the individual's guardian or authorized representative as appropriate, that the driver disclosed any relevant felonies and disclosed if listed on any registry. The administering agency shall ensure that the driver is not listed on the Virginia Sex Offender Registry. Drivers for employment and community transportation must be 18 years or older, have a valid driver's license, and have and maintain at a minimum proof of general liability insurance coverage in compliance with federal or state statutory requirements. The insurance shall insure the driver or the passengers against loss from any liability imposed by law for damages, against damages for care and loss of services because of bodily injury or death of any person, against injury to or destruction of property caused by accident and arising out of the ownership, use, or operation of such motor vehicle within the Commonwealth and any other state in the United States or Canada. For more information, please see Regulation 12 VAC 30-122-440 D4C2. 22-440 state in the United States or Canada. For more information, please see Regulation 12 VAC 30-122-440 D4C2. 'Let's review the allowable activities for employment and community transportation service. Employment and community transportation service may include transportation in a private vehicle by a person such as a coworker or other community member, or the purchase of tickets for public transportation, such as a bus or subway. In either case, an administering agency shall coordinate and bill DMAS. Let's look at an example. Mariah participates in a bowling league every Wednesday night. Her sister Roberta lives several blocks away in Richmond. Roberta picks up Mariah at her apartment to take her to the bowling alley, which is 5 miles away from Mariah's apartment. That would be trip A. Afterwards, Roberta takes Mariah back to her apartment from the bowling alley. That would be trip B. This example demonstrates Mariah getting out more in her community and reimburses a family member for both trip A and trip B. Example 2. Susan uses the Richmond GRTC bus to go back and forth from her apartment to work every Monday through Friday. In addition, she uses the GRTC to go to the grocery store every Sunday. Weekly, Susan uses the GRTC 12 times. She goes to and from work, 10 trips weekly, and to the grocery store, 2 trips weekly. Susan enjoys her routine and plans to continue using the GRTC to facilitate her trips throughout her ISP year. Based on this schedule, Susan will use the bus 624 times this year, which is 12 trips weekly, 52 weeks per year. The total amount for this transportation is billed through employment and community transportation. There are 5 limitations to discuss with employment and community transportation, so let's take a look at each one. This service shall not be authorized or reimbursed for individuals who can access transportation through the state plan or other waiver services that include a transportation component. The individual or legal guardian shall attest on the trip plan form that he does not have sufficient personal financial resources to cover the cost of the transportation themselves. Private transportation is reimbursed according to a trip, which is reimbursed for the round trip and the number of individuals being transported to the location with a maximum of 3 individuals. The rate per trip includes any downtime experienced by the driver, such as breaks between, to, and from trips. There are 3 trip rates depending on the one-way distance traveled. There's less than 10 miles, between 10 and 20 miles, and over 20 miles. The administering agency will coordinate the purchase of tickets for public transportation, which may include a bus or subway, and provide those to the individual. A provider delivering other waiver services to an individual may not utilize staff to provide employment and community transportation, and may only bill if the transportation would not normally be a required element of services. Employment and community transportation service does not cover on-demand transportation such as taxis or gig services to include Uber or Lyft. It is important to also note that ECT is meant to be used for a set scheduled trip of a recurring nature and frequency, or to purchase tickets or passes on established public transport networks for a recurring need for people that cannot afford these expenses. There is a very limited flexibility to accommodate trips to other destinations not submitted in the trip plan. For example, if an individual calls up their ECT driver and asks for a ride somewhere other than what was outlined in the trip plan, this would not be authorized. Please note ECT is currently in the WAM system as non-medical transportation. There are scenarios when employment and community transportation can be used for an individual using a service where the general expectation and allowable activity includes transportation. Let's look here at Joe. Joe lives in a group home, attends day support, and goes to church with his housemates. The group home would transport him in these cases. However, if Joe lives in a group home and gets a job with odd hours, maybe the late afternoon or evening shift when the group home staff are pretty busy getting other residents their dinner and ready for bed, then ECT would allow him a way to get back and forth to work, even though that's an allowable activity and general expectation for the group homes to transport their residents. If Joe wants to do something in the community by himself, go to church or out to dinner with friends without group home staff, ECT can be used. Now, these situations may be rare, but if the individual can handle it and the ECT request comes with a scenario similar and justification clearly identifies that there are no other available or established transportation options for the specific trip need in the area or at the time of day, or that the individual cannot afford the cost of the available transportation options, then it may be authorized. Please note the justification may also cover the following. For ECT to be authorized, the trips must be related to an ISP outcome, the trip purpose and frequency is congruent with the ISP goal, and the outcome does not need to be a skill builder. The trips are for non-medical purposes. The trip distances must be reported accurately and will be verified. Service authorization staff must verify whether the individual receives other direct support services from the ECT provider, for example, employment, residential, personal assistance services, etc. If so, service authorization will confirm that the proposed private community driver is not a member of the ECT administering provider staff. Let's look at a few questions. First, can a provider bill under employment and community transportation when they are providing community engagement or community coaching? No, these services have a transportation component. Second question, can group home providers use their own group home staff to provide employment and community transportation? No, again, group home service has a transportation component. And lastly, can group home staff take someone to work once their shift ends and bill under employment and community transportation? No, group home service has a transportation component. Staff who work in group homes can be a provider for employment and community transportation, but not simultaneously while providing group home services. It is possible for a group home staff to provide ECT to people living outside the group home if other criteria are met. Please review the list of services that have a transportation component. ECT cannot be used to provide transportation in these services. Once it has been determined that no other means of access is available and appropriate outcomes have been written into the ISP supporting employment and community transportation, services can be initiated. Let's review the following examples. 1. If an individual lives in a group home where the transportation supports for employment are not included in the plan for supports, and they need a ride to work, they are able to use ECT. Please note, this includes transportation to work even if they are receiving supported employment service and the job coach is on site. While the job coach may transport, they are not required to do so. Ultimately, the job coach will fade, and it is important for the individual to have worked out and be comfortable with their own transportation arrangements. 2. For an individual living in a sponsored home who wants to go to the grocery store, they may not use ECT. 3. For an individual living in their family home, they cannot use ECT to get to group day support. 4. If living in a supported living apartment, a trip to the shopping mall could be made with ECT. 5. If an individual is leaving a group day support site and going to a volunteer site, then ECT is appropriate. 6. For an individual living in an independent apartment who wants to go to the YMCA, they can use ECT. And 7. If an individual is living in a sponsored home where the person wants to attend spiritual services without their sponsor, they can use ECT. Documentation requirements are as follows. Documentation to support units of service delivered is required, and the documentation shall correspond with billing. For employment and community transportation, the administering agency provider shall include in each individual's record the following. 1. A copy of the completed, standard, age-appropriate assessment form, which is typically the Supports Intensity Scale, or SIS, for people with DD waiver. The provider's plan for supports in the form of the ECT TRIP plan form. 3. Documentation of the trip distance estimate in the form of a MapQuest, Google Maps, or similar printout with point of origin, destination, and mileage. 4. Documentation to support units of service delivered in the form of a monthly trip log, signed by the individual recording trips taken that shall correspond with billing. Providers shall maintain separate documentation for each type of service rendered for an individual. 5. A written review supported by documentation in the individual's record, shall be submitted to the support coordinator quarterly during any quarters in which the service was provided and if modified with the plan for supports. This written review shall list the dates and destinations of trips taken and a statement about the individual's satisfaction with the service. Please note, a WAMS Part 5 is not required for this service. The support coordinator will enter into the shared plan under community-based supports. The administering agency, provider, shall complete a written quarterly review and follow guidelines to include completing the quarterly every quarter during which the person used employment and community transportation, even just once. The quarterly review must be sent to the support coordinator. Support coordinators will include ECT quarterly information into their quarterly review. ECT providers do not need to have their own ISP Part 5. Trip forms are sufficient. The administering agency will need to collaborate with the support coordinator to ensure that they have the correct outcome language for the form. For private drivers, documentation requirements include copies of valid driver's licenses, copy of the automobile insurance policies, copies of driving records, and criminal records, attestations, and Virginia Sex Offender Registry record checks. The driver is responsible for notifying the agency if there are any changes to previously submitted attestations or significant driving record changes, versus requiring the agency to have to obtain these every year or for whatever time period. The Employment and Community Transportation forms can be found on the DMAS website. Please see the link and hyperlink listed here. Once you are on the DMAS website, under General Information, Provider Forms, simply enter the form number and click Search. Corresponding forms will come up and you click on the link to get to the form. The form can be downloaded and is ready for use. The two forms used with ECT include DMAS Form P258 and P259. The first form is the ECT Trip Plan Form. Providers complete this trip plan form and upload it into WAMS along with the printout from MapQuest, Google Maps, or other similar programs for each trip. On the top of the ECT Trip Plan form, identifying information for the individual and provider are entered. For the individual, the name, address, and phone number are required. For the provider enters their agency and agency name, along with the agency type, either a DBHDS licensed agency, a Center for Independent Living, or an employment service organization. Whether or not the individual is receiving other services from the ECT provider is documented, and if so, which services. There are multiple areas on the 3-page form to enter each trip. For each trip, the provider lists the purpose of the trip, the ISP outcome the trip is supporting, the origin address, destination, and trip frequency. For each trip, the travel method is also documented, whether it is a private vehicle or public transportation. For private vehicles, the number of miles, riders, and trips are reported on. Please note that a one-way trip begins at the eligible rider's point of origin and ends at the eligible rider's destination. A maximum number of 3 riders plus the driver are allowed in a vehicle. The administering agency can be paid for a maximum of 3 ECT-approved riders per trip. For public transportation, the type, number of trips per month, and monthly cost are documented. On the ECT Trip Plan form, at the bottom of page 2, there is an attestation that needs to be completed. This attestation is confirming the trips being requested are not covered under other Medicaid services and that the individual does not have personal resources to cover the cost of transportation. The second form associated with ECT is the ECT monthly trip log. On the ECT monthly trip log, you enter identifying information at the top and below detail your trips. Detail includes the date, the point of origin, the exact address, and the destination, again the exact address. Once complete, the individual signs, guardian if applicable, and the driver. Other documentation requirements include the following. For public transportation, receipts for purchases of bus tickets or fare cards. All correspondence to the individual and the individual's family, caregiver as appropriate, the support coordinator, DMAS, and DBHDS. Written documentation of all contacts with family, caregiver, physicians, formal and informal service providers, and all professionals regarding the individual. And written attestation by the individual or legal guardian that the individual does not have sufficient personal financial resources, for example through wages, to cover the cost of the transportation themselves. The DBHDS website provides contact information for the Office of Licensing, Office of Human Rights, and the Division of Developmental Services. Community resource consultants with DDS are available in each region to assist with questions about the DD waivers. Additional contacts are available on the DBHDS website, and that is listed. If you have questions about this training or anything related to DD waiver services, you can reach out to the appropriate community resource consultant on either the individual, provider, or system team in your region. The Office of Provider Development thanks you for participating in this training